So we're going to be transitioning to our next segment, and we're, as Scott Murray would say, we're in the home stretch of our day. This is the second day in the Defense Innovation Summit, which is the capstone, if you will, for the entire series called the Cyber, Land, Air, Sea, and Space Symposium that we held over the course of the month of April. This was 6 days. This will have been 6 days of programming, 48 hours programming, 170 speakers and panelists and other contributors. We have a fantastic team and a fantastic set of sponsors: Bell, Elbit, EY, and Long Capture have been really supportive of us, done a great job, have participated in the event, as well as sponsored us as our sponsors. So we want to thank them for all their contributions. And what we'd like to do next is we'd like to bring up a great friend, and I said as a sponsor, Steve Mathias of Bell. Steve is someone I've known for some time, has been a panelist and a moderator, et cetera, and he's going to have a great conversation with Nadia Schadlow, who was one of the architects or the writer of our national security strategy under the previous administration. Steve, are you there with us, sir?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. It's great to have you here, sir. And if it's all right, I'll give a quick bio on you so people have a little understanding of who you are and a little bit about your background for this discussion. So Steve Mathias is Vice President, Global Military Sales and Strategy at Bell. In this role, he leads Bell's military sales, business development, and strategy for current military products for the United States government and all commercial and military products to the global military market, including the aftermarket services that support these products. Prior to joining Bell, Steve was the Deputy Chief of Staff, United States Army Special Operations Command, G8. His military experience includes a special operations and conventional forces background in aviation operations, capability development, strategic planning, budget development, force development, and training. Steve served in multiple overseas assignments and combat tours to include Korea, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, as well as several other European and Southwest Asian locations. So, Steve, it is an honor to have you here. Thank you for your service to our country, both in and outside of out of uniform. Really appreciate you and Bell's support. Really looking forward to this conversation that you and Nadia are going to have. And I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thanks. Thanks, David. I really appreciate it. It's quite an honor to be on the stage today with Nadia. Nadia is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, as well as a visiting fellow at MITRE and the Hoover Institution. She had served previously in the Department of Defense in her earlier part of her career, but more recently, she was a lead architect for the 2017 National Security Strategy, which diagnosed the current problems that the United States was facing, putting great power competition front and center, and more specifically, the strategic challenges posed by China. Her book, War and the Art of Governance, focused on the U.S. Army's role in political and economic reconstruction during war. Again, it's really an honor to be on the stage with such a national security expert. Nadia, over to you.
An expert who still hasn't learned how to use the mute button. Thanks, Steve. Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be a participant in this. It's my first time at America's Future Series. It's really an extraordinary event, and I haven't listened to all 4 days, but I've popped in and out, and it's really been great. And I didn't realize that we were sort of wrapping up, so we have to keep people's attention here. And in a way, I think it's appropriate to sort of wrap up at the strategic level, at thinking of some of the big issues, which hopefully then capture what you all have listened to over the past 4 days. So Steve and I thought that today we would structure our discussion around the idea of how great power competition is presenting the US military and our allies with really some key operational challenges, and then thinking about how industry can help solve or make progress on overcoming some of these operational challenges, right? That's the fundamental issue in a way, I think, over the past 4 days as well. So I'm going to start, as I set up, frame this discussion, and it will be a discussion with a quote. And the quote begins, "The traditional means and methods of projecting power and accessing the global commons are growing increasingly obsolete, becoming wasting assets in the language of defense strategists." Basically, this means that the diffusion of advanced military technologies make it more expensive in blood and treasure for the US military to carry out its missions. That observation about wasting assets was made over 10 years ago by a friend of mine, a very well-known defense strategist, Andrew Krepanevich. I'm sure many of you in the audience know him. So that quote essentially of that, we're losing the edge was made 10 years ago in 2009. It's very applicable today, which is the problem, right? It's been over 10 years, and you could make that probably the same statement today, if not even worse, right? The operational challenges in many domains are only growing worse. And many of you on this call and on the previous panel are right there, front and center, working on ways to overcome them. But some include essentially the problem of modernizing nuclear forces. Russia and China are both doing so, increasing the numbers and capabilities of weapons in their existing programs, delivery systems with increased capabilities, nuclear weapons with smaller yields, allowing for probably improved precision, all of this in the nuclear domain. In space, our ability to operate freely is hampered in many, many ways. Cyber vulnerabilities only seem to increase every day. Our grid, technically outside the DoD domain, is very, very vulnerable, remains vulnerable, and that will have huge operational challenges for our military if it goes down. So you see, anti-access area denial, also an area all of you are familiar with. These problems are getting worse, and they will only be solved with a more effective integration of DoD and industry. So I thought sort of that would tee it up in a way for Steve maybe to comment a little bit on what you think industry can do in this domain, or what can we do better in that nexus of cooperation between the two.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. And I plug back out to David in the American Future Series. These type of events are certainly important. I think David said yesterday about change and how important change is, and having conversations and get beyond the conversations to get to action. I'm also a little bit cautious every time I have a stage like this to throw out a bunch of recommendations and poke people in the eye, because I think we do need to recognize there's been a lot of really, really great progress over the last several years by the government and defense industry. So it's important to keep that in mind, but I do think it's important that we do continue to look to the future and drive forward. And I think for me, there's 4 things that I'll probably hit throughout our conversation today that I believe are important for not just DoD, but I think it's a collective we. It's the defense industry and the government, but continuing to invest in technology and the U.S. defense industrial base. That defense industrial base, I really didn't understand it probably all that well until I left the military, maybe my last job in the military, but certainly when I got out to industry, started realizing just how important this industrial base is we have in the U.S. and what it means to the national security. Second would be continue to press rapid acquisition and deployment strategies. The third is encourage, and I'd argue even demand transparency. Transparency builds trust, allows you to two parties to more quickly get through conflict and get to quicker resolution, which really means getting more technology into the hands of our warfighters quicker. And then the last piece that I'll want to hit a little bit today, the fourth one, is don't forget about our partner nations. Success in the great power competition will take our partner nations. Thoughts on that, Nadia?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Some general thoughts. I mean, agreeing on increased investments, but and so I guess my role will be more of the critic on the outside. So it's good. You're right. There's been a huge amount of progress. There are programs at DoD that have been, I think, hugely successful in many ways. Will Roper was mentioned a lot. Air Force Works, the previous work that Ellen Lord had done in her capacity. I mean, there's been a lot of positive change at DoD over the past few years. But there's still areas where we can do better. For instance, I was, reading. Yes, I actually read GAO reports. I find them very informative. I'd imagine that. But a really interesting one from about early 2020 discussed how there's still this lack of transparency between where industry is putting its R&D funding and what DoD needs, and that's a communication problem, right? You have money going into R&D, billions of dollars going in from industry, DoD, but the lack of communication between the two means there's often overlap, gaps where things don't get connected, and that's a problem we can solve, meaning DoD can solve that problem by improving transparency, by aligning databases, using all the technology that's been talked about over the past few days. On the rapid acquisition, that's definitely the case, but we've seen this for years now. I mean, the willingness to take risk to understand that there will be trade-offs with more rapidity, but we have to take those risks. We are running out of time, and time really matters in this competition that we're in. Time is an undervalued component of power. It's not a traditional measure of power, but it needs to be. And it needs to be quantified, and it can be quantified actually in a way. And we need to start to consider how to do that. Again, Will Roper, giving him a lot of plugs, but last year, did a really interesting talk on how quickly the turnaround was in prototyping of planes, in the 50s and 60s, like 5 years, things that today would take years and years and years. So we've just got to fix it. We've got to do it. We can't afford to have the same quote that Andy Krepanevich had in 2009. We can't afford to be writing that in 2 years from now. So I think government's moving a lot in the right direction, but I like to group things as areas that we can control, the internalities, and then the externalities. And the externalities are driven by what our adversaries and competitors are doing to ourselves. The internal is stuff that we do to ourselves. So we're in balance, Steve. With you're the optimist. I'm the cynic today.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm typically not the optimist. I try to say I'm an aggressive realist. I'm not a pessimist, but sometimes a realist looks like a pessimist. Today, I guess I look like an optimist. I think I harken back to yesterday, Lieutenant General Neil Thurgood and the Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technologies Office, the RCCTO. Now, granted, he works in a much smaller organization, maybe perhaps similar to what I did in the special ops community when Secretary Kurtz was then the acquisition executive at USSOCOM. So those organizations are a little smaller chain of command. But General Thurgood talked yesterday about making it shorten the chain of command, defining mission sets, and not making a lot of changes, and then having high performing people, and you can get to things much more quickly. I have seen, my experience of late has been certainly more on the future vertical lift. And so when I mentioned transparency, the Joint Multi-Role Tech Demonstrator comes to mind. Is the U.S. government was involved with that from the beginning, data sharing, test pilots flying the aircraft, a lot of transparency. But I know there is a lot of room for improvement.
And I think other areas in terms of what industry might do better, in terms of thinking about what they might do better. So I don't know what your thoughts are, Steve, on this, but essentially there are areas probably, where they could do better as well. One is security, right? I mean, it's a tough problem. It's one that the government has as well. But when you read just recently, there was really a significant breach with a Chinese national just arrested for selling really important information or to providing really important information to the Chinese military about undersea drones, really significant and probably it will advance China's undersea drone program pretty significantly. And that was an IP theft issue. So we continually see problems like that, supply chain issues, companies understandably, some smaller ones don't have maybe the capacity to protect themselves as they need to, but then we need mechanisms for improved communication, all of those things. But that's looking at one area where industry might do better. So we're not blaming government as well on everything. I don't know, is that realistic, Steve, from your perspective? I mean, you work for a big company, so security is pretty good, but smaller companies probably have different capabilities.
Yeah, it's a really great point, Nadia. The intellectual property discussion, of course, is front and center in a lot of discussions, and where the U.S. government's going to go with that, and what they expect from industry going forward. And certainly Bell supports working with the government to figure out how you share IP so that you can get to better data sharing. And we do everything now, developing, building, and hopefully in the future sustaining on the digital thread. So it's all data that's resident there that is at risk. We take that very seriously at Bell, certainly. And I know our suppliers do as well, because we're all on the same digital thread, or the intent is that we would all be on the same digital thread. It's an interesting point, because I would tie it, I guess, not necessarily changing the subject, but tie it to going back to the partner nations piece, because a lot of this new technology, if we're really talking about making our partner nations strong, if we're really going to talk about great power competition, then we need the partner nations working early on export policy so that we can share IP, or we can share technologies across the globe in the right way. is something that's a bit of a challenge right now on some of the future technologies. I know the U.S. government team, particularly the Army, is working through that now in future vertical lift, but it's not an easy solution because we're focused really internally.
Well, that's actually a good point of like asking the question, what is preventing deeper cooperation with our allies in some of these key technical areas? You know, and if we can answer that question, what are the key sticking points? We can work on that problem set and resolve it. And it does involve, there's always risk, right? And weighing of both together. So I don't want to sound like I think that, you know, with security, you're never going to get 100% security, right? You're going to have to be willing to take some risk in order to improve cooperation, for instance. But I thought, you know, we'd go maybe back a little bit to government, because some of the big issues that you and I talked about a little bit offline might be worth talking about as well. I think a role where the government could do better, and the services as well, is in setting forth a strategy, right? Because it is that strategy and the articulation of a strategy and the articulation of these operational concepts that provide industry and innovators with a way to come and try to meet those requirements. There was an interesting article, I think yesterday or today in the Wall Street Journal by a colleague of mine at the Hudson Institute, Seth Cropsey, who pointed out, in his view, the Navy didn't have such a strategy, and this is hampering the development of, hampering the integration of the best technologies and the best approaches. Now, I'm sure there are many on this call or on this Zoom that might disagree with him, but it was a good example of how DoD could actually, this is within DoD's hands as well, right, to set forth what it wants to do, what the services should be doing, what their view is of what they should be doing, so that industry can respond. So that is, in my view, in the sort of the role of government basket that we've been talking about. I don't know what you think about that. You're former, you're, I think, former aviator yourself, and so is that a fair criticism, or what do you think, Steve?
Yeah, I think it is. But, you know, I want to go back to this really great document that someone wrote, the National Security Strategy, back in 2017. Someone that was lead architecture for it. There's my favorite, or maybe my favorite line in that strategy is: the United States must retain overmatch the combination of capabilities and sufficient scale to prevent enemy success and to ensure the American sons and daughters will never be in a fair fight. And I have a son who's an aviator in the 3rd Infantry Division now, so I certainly don't want a fair fight. So talking about an overarching strategy, if you will, a grand strategy, that kind of gets to the point, but then how do we execute that strategy in acquisition terms? And so I'm going to sound like I'm still the optimist in this, but, you know, if you look at, I'm now just saying what the Army's doing because of the CFTs that they've established, and in particular the future vertical lift and all the comments that Chief Staff of the Army has made. It does appear that there's a strategy there, right? And funding is going to be a challenge. I think that if there was an issue, perhaps it's still a matter of how do you execute that strategy quickly, given the current laws or policies and regulations. Going back to General Thurgood's comments yesterday, is he won't ever do anything that's against the law, but if there's policies or regulations that could be adjusted, then go to the person who owns those and see if you can make a change. So I don't know, I hope I'm not being argumentative, is that we don't have a strategy. It seems like maybe we don't have an operational plan to execute our strategy. Is that fair? Or
yeah, I think I think it probably depends at what level we're talking about strategy. But I do think that the 2017 strategy, I'm biased because I worked on it, but with many people, right? But I do think it set forth a different strategic direction for the country. And to your point, Steve, I like the overmatch point as well. It's a term that's mainly used in military circles. It's not as commonly used externally. So I think it's good to introduce that way of thinking to Americans as a whole. But essentially, the importance of that 2017 strategy was to ensure that all the different components of American power and the recognized, what was at stake, that it was a whole of government effort. It's a term I don't like, but a whole of society it was a whole of society effort necessary in the economic, political, military, and technological planes to compete better. DoD does not control all of those areas, right? So we needed to get people to understand that it was the role of industry to think about where they stood in this competition. And it was the role of universities to think about where they stood in this competition. And it was the role of the Commerce Department and even the Treasury Department to think differently about these areas as well. And so that was the significance of the 2017 strategy. It also drew out something called the National Security Innovation Base, which I like as a term better than the Defense Industrial Base, because I think it really captures the whole thing, all of the technology. You can use Defense Industrial Base, but I like National Security Innovation Base since it captures some of the, the newer areas, right? And has less of the connotation of the old industrial base concepts and issues. So, I do agree in some domains, but I think probably, I guess I would, if this were a conversation, we were actually all together, I would ask some in the audience to say, if the criticism of the Navy in that op-ed was accurate today or not. And I'm sure there are a lot of different views on it. But, thanks for bringing up the strategy.
Yeah, one of the things that I do think we can do better, there's several things, the funding, of course, and we'll see what happens with this year's budget, whether it stays flat or not. But I think across the services, having a common way to, for example, assess the new technologies. How do you develop and how do you evaluate and assess new technologies in the concept phase and standardize across the services? And that might include, we were talking yesterday about the joint capability of communications. That would be where someplace I'd really love to see some effort put onto strategy is getting after standardizing across the services. Thoughts over?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm glad that you made it. And again, I think this creates a lot of, there are lots of different views about this, but it is something that DoD can do to help itself. I've been doing some work in the battery domain, for instance, recently, and there is no way we can build. There's no way we can dramatically improve in that domain in terms of our ability to scale without some effort by DoD to introduce standards. Right? We can't have 353 different types of batteries in use by our forces, by all of the different services. We can't do it. We have to take decisions. Everyone's going to have to give up something, part of their special piece that, special technology that they might want or for the good of the whole, right? We're going to have enough problems producing batteries at scale in this country for a whole host of other reasons, because right now we don't control any part of that battery supply chain. Every part of it, from the minerals to the processing, to the battery assembly, to the recycling, all of it is dominated by China today. So at the very least, as we seek now to use batteries in more of our defense systems, again, for undersea, for drones, for autonomous systems, in all different ways, standardization will become very important. And I know that's a word that creates, gets people riled up, but it is important. That's an area I know a little bit more about in terms of batteries. I know it applies to other areas as well. And to your point, Steve, it's an area that requires almost less of DoD, right? Like fewer special specifications, not more in certain areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how much you stay in touch with this MOSA or the modular open system approach, but it seems to me like that is a key to all discussions going forward in linking things together. Bell certainly supports MOSA and with our teammates. We think that's something that's really going to enable rapid fielding and advanced capabilities. It's going to reduce costs. It's going to allow us to evolve much quicker, so the platforms potentially don't have to change, but certainly equipment changes, missions equipment just change within that. Do you have any background in MOSA or thoughts on that, Nadia?
No, I don't, but I will look into it because it does seem applicable then to some of these, the issue of scale, which is really at the issue, as I said, of many of the supply chain reshoring issues that we need to think about. It will probably even be actually more complicated, but something to think about in terms of cooperation with partners and allies, right, as well. So you're going to have to consider those issues as well in those cooperative programs, which make them even more complicated and hard to do, but nonetheless, it's necessary.
Yeah, the security supply discussion is one I spend a lot of time around the globe, less physically right now, but certainly virtually. But before COVID, I was traveling significantly and talking to ministers and senior military officials around the globe. And And to technology, so many of our partner nations certainly want to be on board with all of our advanced technologies when they can be. Many of them want to have advancements in their own platforms, but all of them, I've never heard any of them say that they didn't need security of supply. So as we look at ensuring our partner nations have equipment that is compatible with our own equipment, ensuring they also have the means to keep it flying, driving, working in a major conflict where security of supply or the supply chain may be interrupted. Just a point to throw out that was on my mind.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it's probably one of the most complex, wicked problems, so to use that term today, supply chain security, because it involves so many different elements. It's not just there's the sort of cyber element of, are the chips in that supply chain, do they have integrity? Do you know where they come from? There's the element of sustainment, right? Supply chain security also includes the capability to sustain what you're buying and what you're using. It includes an element of resiliency if things go down. It includes an element of where are you willing to take risks or not, in terms of how much does need to be produced here in the United States versus in Korea, Japan, Germany. And actually, that's another area in terms of where government could be helpful in sending a signal. So in most of the strategic documents I've been reading, they don't tend to get to that next level of at what point are we comfortable with having a certain percentage of these components produced abroad, right? Are we comfortable? Can DoD move to increased reliance on new energy sources like batteries if 50% of those batteries are produced in the United States versus 30% in Japan versus 20% elsewhere? Those kinds of demand signals aren't really out there, right? In a way, it would be what a friend Anthony Vinci, who has written on these matters, has called an economic net assessment, right? What do we need? What are those signals? What are we building toward, right? How much do we need to produce here and why? And I haven't really seen that yet in some of the new material out there. The Biden administration has new executive orders on supply chains, but it's not just about what we have to do to bring everything back here. It's what are we, do we need to bring everything back here? How much in Europe? How much in Asia? And what percentages will give us that comfort level of resiliency? And I haven't seen much on that. I don't know if you have, Steve.
No, nothing from a strategic perspective, really, or nothing significant. It's another area, supply chain is another area that, 7 years ago plus when I was still in active duty, didn't really even cross my mind. Completely different perspective now on what supply chain means. We saw a little interruption during COVID. Fortunately, not a significant interruption for Bell. We were able to continue on, but I know, friends that have small businesses in Fort Worth, Texas, that have supply chain issues right now because of multiple different issues, and it has a huge impact on their business, and thus when it affects the national security innovation industry, then it has an impact on national security. I'm going to have in just a second David open maybe up for a few questions, but before, as David's prepping to do that, Nadia, do you have any other thoughts just in general before we would potentially open up for some questions? You're still muted, Nadia.
Sorry, to end on a to sort of sum up on a positive note, I think we have made a great deal of progress because there's a broader sense, especially in the national security community, of the challenges we face, right? Everyone in this audience inherently thinks in a competitive way, right? It's part of your business, it's part of your backgrounds. Many other government agencies don't think competitively other than key parts of the business. So this idea of competition that really came front and center from 2017 on, which the Biden administration is continuing, is an important and necessary first step in setting the strategic direction we need to start now to solve some of these actual operational problems. But we just need to all of us work more quickly before we run out of time and before we find ourselves sort of boxed in or without the freedom of action that we need because it's too late.
Yeah, thank you. The time piece is the most important resource, right? It's something we never get back, but it's hard to judge how much time you have, particularly in this kind of setting with the great power competition. We read about it every day. I think everybody saw the news probably I think we've fired some warning shots in the Persian Gulf within the last 24, 48 hours. Those things always make us a bit nervous, and you never know how much time you have. And David, I really will go over to you to ask questions, but I remember, I think it was Secretary Gertz before he's in his position now, was visiting at the company and made the comment about, what do we do after on December 8th? What do we do when we have another significant attack? Are we ready as a change in my terms, a national security innovation base to respond? And that's, I'm going to use that term now instead of industrial base.
Thank you. You can use the acronym in NSIB, right? NSIB. You've made it in Washington when you have a new acronym. That's really the success. That's the sign of professional success.
Awesome. That was great. So David, if you're up on the net, I think we agreed we'd take a few questions here, perhaps. And if David's not, he may be. I'll look. We have a couple, I think, in the queue here on the side.
Yeah, I guess we can ask ourselves some of the questions that are coming up.
You see the one on batteries there. You want to hit that?
Yeah, there was one question about, so transparency with, so there's Dave. Hi, Dave. Do you want to ask some of the questions or?
No, let's go ahead and do the one that you're doing. But then, yes, I would love to ask a question.
Okay, good. As long as it's not a tough one.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Transparency. So this is one maybe for Steve, thinking about the balance between transparency with our allies and partners, and then are we open then to losing our tech savvy, our technology due to cyber warriors from Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, very sophisticated cyber capabilities. How do we manage that? We talked about that a little bit, but do you have any comments?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I do a lot of work in foreign military sales or commercial sales to foreign militaries. Our government's got a really thorough process to figure out export policy and what can be exported and what can't and who does it go to. But there's always a risk, right? And even when we sell a platform to a country, they may later want to sell it, but they're supposed to come back through the U.S. So it's a challenge to me personally. My thought is it's a challenge between how do we, because it does help the NSIB to have foreign military sales, right? It helps keep the industry viable, but there is the risk for technology. So we've had a lot of discussion internally to Bell about, okay, how do we prep the Future Vertical Lift, our B-280, the Future Long Range Assault Aircraft, to be exported? Because everywhere I go around the globe, when I go talk aircraft to countries, every one of them, doesn't matter what level of country they want to classify them as, they're all interested in what the United States is doing on Future Vertical Lift. We're way ahead of everyone else. So they want that technology. So, as an industry, we need to make money so that we can continue to make great products for our servicemen and women and the warfighters. So it's a tough line. I think what we have right now in the U.S. government to make sure that what we do as a nation to export technology is pretty thorough. And so therefore it's probably as good as you can get as far as protecting that type of information. Over.
Yeah, I agree, Steve, in the sense that you're never going to have 100% security. You can do the best you can. There's always going to be an element of risk, but you have to weigh that of the cooperation.
So if I may chime in on that, and we've talked a lot about America's future, and the need for America to remain the strongest military, political, and economic power for the good of the entire world. That's sort of a basic position. But we very much talk about America not being alone, that it's not America on its own, that it's America with and together with our allies. And so the conversation you're having about our export policy, et cetera, and how we partner and how we share information as a matter of national security, it seems to be the only way we can compete with a country that has a vast number of more people, just more technologists, et cetera. We have to do a better job and have a better way of trusting but verifying, working with our partners. If we don't do that, do you not see that if we do not improve our ability to collaborate and share with our allies, is that a national security risk if we're not able to improve on that?
To a degree, yes, but it is not just up to the United States. So certainly allies and partners are a competitive advantage that the United States has in a whole range of areas. but security is not a spectator sport. Allies and partners need to come to the table as well with what they have to offer. They also have to make it easier, or to work with the United States, to work with American companies. There are a lot of trade barriers in Europe, right? There are a lot of trade barriers around the world. So it's not all up to the United States, right? There's money does matter, right? Defense spending budgets do matter. There's a lot of in-kind contributions as well, but even at the policy level, allies and partners need to ensure that their publics understand what's at stake and make arguments that are similar to what we've made in our national security documents. Because when you look at some of the polling figures across Europe, it's pretty alarming, right? The European publics, I mean, I'm generalizing, but not really, the facts are there, are pretty ambivalent in some respects about whether or not they think their troops should be front and center, should NATO be faced with the challenge. So I agree with the question, but it's not all up to the United States.
So well said. So, and it's not just a matter of treasure in terms of dollars. If they seem to be reluctant as a percentage of GDP to spend a representative amount of their GDP relative to the United States, and certainly to put their blood, to put their best and brightest, their young people that serve in harm's way, they are even more reticent to do that. So I have to agree with you that it has to be a partnership, and that's a multifaceted discussion, right?
Right. And there was a Pew poll in 2017 that I came across, which basically said, all the European countries polled, and they included, Germany, several of the NATO countries. The poll came up, said, no, we expect Americans to be there on the ground first, should there be an Article 5 violation of NATO. And I thought to myself at the time, wow, if the White House saw this poll, some people in that White House in 2017 would be really mad. I remember, I think I saw it like a year later after I had already left. And I thought, wow, this is going to make some people really mad. But it's out there, and it was pretty astonishing.
Well, it seems to be analogous to the idea that the police are not only are they there to protect and serve and maybe go get bad guys, but they're also your bodyguard. They want us to be their bodyguard before anything bad happens. We need to intercede and put ourselves in the way, and we need to have a very honest discussion about that. Last thing I'd like to direct towards Steve and Nadia. At the end of each of these discussions that we had, and we've had 170 people speak so far in this program, 6 days, 48 hours, all this good stuff. One of the things that we pride ourselves on is having people on like you that have prescriptions, they have recommendations, things that they'd like the public to know. That one is a large defense prime who's very innovative, Bill, and another is a national security leader. What takeaways, what things do we need to do more? What would you tell the audience that we really need to get serious about? And what changes? Are there any specific changes that you would think in matters of national security or in the way that we work with the primes in order to develop the capabilities we need? What does the public need to understand, and what do we need to do to make that a possibility? And I'll defer to either of you.
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at it. It's this idea you read off my bio, and I was fortunate enough to spend some part of my career in the special operations community, and there this soft truths. The first is humans are more important than hardware. As a nation, where we go in educating our young adults, and then making sure we have the people we need in the future to develop this amazing technology is, I think, one of the most critical things we all need to be considerate of. And I was extraordinarily fortunate in my military career to work with just amazing people. So when I left the military and went into industry, I anticipated this downturn in quality just because I'm a realist. And what I found was actually, it was the opposite. No offense to the folks I worked with in the Army, but the quality of people is amazing, but it's finite, right? So I think it's just something we really all have to be cognizant of, that if we're truly going to maintain, the ability to compete in the great power competition, we have to have the people. And then of course we have to have the investment. Money is always important as well. Over.
So Nadia, any thoughts on that?
I agree. I agree with all of Steve's points. I mean, I think that we need to be effective at doing many things at once, right? We can't. I mean, I think sometimes the word priority is overused in this domain in these discussions because it's an excuse to sort of say, well, we don't have to worry about all the other stuff. But the fact is, we do. We have to worry about a lot of things at once, because it's all intertwined in a way today that you really see. I mean, to your point, Steve, the people matter for a whole bunch of reasons. And one being that STEM reason of having enough of a pipeline into the technologies. I mean, everyone in this audience knows, but everything in this domain, even more so because of the nature of technology, I think is intertwined in a way that I think is actually fundamental or quite different than in the past. Maybe not fundamentally, but quite different. Different in scope, different in character. So be careful of the word priority sometimes at these big levels, because I think it leads you down a kind of a false path.
Okay, so I think there's an interesting tie here in your all's comments. I'd like your opinion on this. It seems to me to be a matter of national security that we be able to develop, attract, develop great talent, people who are dedicated to our national security, want to work in the defense industry, et cetera, and want to serve in our military. And I believe 80% of all those people who ever served in the United States military come from Texas, a swath from Texas to the Carolinas. And 80% of those who ever served, or those that did serve, have a family member that served. So there seems to be a disconnect culturally in America between those who have an affinity for the military, for our national security, are willing to serve, willing to be part of the defense complex, et cetera. So we talked about Europe and a disdain for being involved or engaged or even responsible for, in some cases, for their own defense. As a matter of national security, it seems to me that we need to do a better job of educating our own population, of bringing up the next generation, engaging them and preparing them to be part of this great endeavor. Any thoughts on that? I mean, you guys get some of the best and the brightest, Steve and Nadia, but it does seem to be a matter of national security, and we need to, pardon the word, prioritize this. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's a very fair statement, and I completely agree with you. It's a big problem. One potential solution would be to look at school curriculums around the country and see how and if, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be the if, any baseline of what the military is, what it does, what role it's played in American history is included. My sense is no, and I think things are only going to get worse because I don't think school curriculum today is moving in a direction where it would be even anywhere near describing this. So at the very basic level, right? Public schools especially, but private schools too, I don't think any of it is there, even introducing young people to what our military represents. Even in Veterans Days here, I mean, in my experience in sort of suburban public school communities, veterans are often presented as victims. And I can't speak about this because I have not had operational experience, but many of my friends in the military, officers, have been very upset about this, right? They're presented as victims of PTSD and it's the problems they'd have experienced. This is on Veterans Day. It's not the accomplishments of what our military has accomplished. So at to your point earlier about what can we do specifically, we can look and see if there's any addressing of this issue at all in school curriculums from elementary school on. And my bet is that the answer is probably no, except maybe in the states that you mentioned, maybe not, but it would be a good research project for someone.
Sounds like a great endeavor for someone. Steve, as someone who served, and thank you for your service, especially as a special operator in that community. Love to get your thoughts on this. Bell has helped us, has been supportive of our Magellan Award, which is given to someone who served and they continues to serve. We celebrate veterans' contributions, their accomplishments, both in and out of uniform. And Bob Hastings is a past recipient of that award. But anyway, with that backdrop, love to get your thoughts on this, and maybe as closing comments, closing thoughts on this with regard to that subject.
Yeah, thanks. So from a STEM perspective or education perspective, I think that's something we all have to focus on. I don't care if it's Russell, Iowa, which is where I graduated high school, or if it's somewhere in New York City. That's important. Education is important. I think I would argue a little bit, having commanded an aviation squadron in the Army and had people serving next to me from everywhere across the United States and the territories. I'm a little cautious about, banding parts of our nation as, less informed than others or less willing to serve. I know that wasn't your point, but I just have served with so many good folks. And even today outside the military, watching what people are doing in service is very encouraging. Now, that said, I do think there's a lot of room for improvement, and we have to continue to work on it. And it is important, national strategy is in our security, because how we sit as a nation and how we take care of each other and the people is, and to me, a fundamental reason of why we've been successful as a nation for so long. It's why people turn to us. I had a Dutch officer in my Army War College class that we'd have these discussions about what U.S.'s role was across the globe, and he said, whether we like it or not, the nations do turn to us as the light on the hill, or a shining light on the hill, and we have a role to play in that. So it's important, I think, just from a national security perspective, that we acknowledge it and take it on. I know every administration is going to take it on differently, but as a whole, we as a nation have to take that on.
Well
I think
said.
it's taken on, I mean, in the educational world, it's addressed more at the college university level, where you see debates, right, about ROTC on campuses or not. But we could explore ways to look at what's happening below that level in all different types of schools across America.
A simple fix is to have everybody serve for a year, right? Like the Israelis, right? Then we'd all have an appreciation, right? It's my Forrest Gump version of that. So anyway, I want to thank you so much for your time and your contributions and your insights. Today's very important discussion. I want to thank Bell for being our title sponsor. Nadia, thank you for the work that you've done and continue to do. And I hope you guys have a great evening, and I hope to see you down the road very soon.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Thanks, Nadia. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Dave. Bye.
Bye now. Well, that was amazing. Two very, very impressive people, and people who continue to contribute to our nation and its security in all the work that they do. Up next, we're going to have a little discussion here. I think we might be taking a little break. I think we've got about maybe 5 or 10 minute break, and then we're going to come back and have a very special segment to cap off our entire program. So come back and see us in about 5-6 minutes.